Welcome to Hey Jude, What's Cooking? Today I'm going to make a very simple Italian appetizer. Basically it's focaccia bread, which this is actually unbaked. This is what the product will look like, the final product right before I bake it. And a bruschetta topping, which is simply tomatoes, basil, a little olive oil, salt, pepper, red pepper, and that's it, just for the topping. Typically focaccia is just a wonderful rich olive oil bread. It doesn't necessarily always go with the bruschetta, but I thought it was a nice combination. Also, you can serve bruschetta on grilled bread or toast or anything you have. It's great to keep around. If you have extra bruschetta left over, make a sauce out of it and render it for a pasta dish, fresh pasta. But in this case, I'm just going to teach you how to make the focaccia dough. Very, very, very simple. And when you're done, you'll cut it into small pieces and you'll serve it with a bruschetta. And so let's start on the focaccia because that takes the longest. We start out with 2 cups of flour. I'm going to put everything into my KitchenAid bowl. And I'm also going to do a teaspoon of salt. Mix that up a little bit. And then what you want to do is just make a well in the center of your bowl. Now, if you don't have a KitchenAid, you can do this by hand with a fork. But just make a little well in the center, and that gives you a little bit of room to move with regard to the water and the olive oil. We're going to put about a tablespoon of olive oil in the center of the well. We're also going to put the yeast water. What I did was I went ahead and proofed the yeast, which means I activated the freeze-dried yeast in warm water. If we're 98.6 degrees, the water should be slightly warm to the touch, which means it's around 100. You don't want it really scalding hot or above 110 because it'll kill the yeast. The other thing is if you want the yeast to proof or activate very quickly, it lives on carbohydrates. So you could put a little bit of flour in the water, or even better, a little bit of sugar, which is a simple carbohydrate as opposed to the complex carbohydrate that's flour. That'll mean that because it's a simple carbohydrate, it's broken down a little bit quicker. And the proof is really in seeing all of these bubbles. This is the yeast giving off CO2. That's their expiration. They're giving it off. So we're going to go ahead and put this in. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and mix this by hand, only because not all of you have KitchenAids at home. So I'm just going to show you how easy it is. Essentially, you'd want to keep that water in the center, and you want to just kind of mix it around a little bit, very, very slowly to get those edges in. And you keep going until you sort of have a slurry. And then you keep going a little bit more until you sort of have a dough ball. We're going to keep going until we have as much of this wet dough covered with flour. And then we're going to knead it. Kneading is really, really important. It stretches the gluten strands and it gives the dough a much better texture. So I'm going to keep trying to get as much wet dough to grasp onto that flour before I take it off and knead it. Okay, let me get a little bit more on there. I'm sort of kneading inside the bowl. Now I'm going to turn it out so you all can see. And there we go. And there's still a fair amount of wet dough, so I can kind of try to pick up that last little bit of flour. Now, I'm going to need a little bit of flour to knead with. We call that bench flour. And that provides us with a little bit more flour. It makes more dough because you're adding more flour. It also makes sure that the dough doesn't stick. So let me just grab a little bit of bench flour. I'm going to take about a half a cup, but I'm not going to use all of the bench flour. I'm going to start off by using just a little bit. Spread it around. And when you knead, you push down, fold over, and then make that sort of stick. Rotate, fold over, push it down. To rotate. And you keep doing this so that all sides of the dough are exposed to the flour and are folded over. And as soon as the dough starts absorbing all of that flour you've used for the bench flour, you can add a little bit more in. Now, if I wanted to do this very, very quickly, I would just go ahead and do it in the KitchenAid, but I wanted to do this by hand because I thought not everyone has a KitchenAid at home. So we're going to still keep doing this until it really feels good. One of the ways that I teach my students as to whether the dough is done is, first of all, is it sticky or not? If it's not sticky, then probably it's absorbed enough flour. Secondly, is it smooth as your earlobe? If I look at this, I can see a lot of wrinkles. It's not terribly smooth. I really want it very, very smooth. If you look at the surface of this dough, it's really nice and smooth and has a little bit of a sort of a supple look. It looks very soft as well. So we want to kind of knead it so it looks a little softer and smoother. I'm almost there. And I can kind of feel it's kind of a little sticky, so it wants just a little bit more flour. So let me just get this in there. And then actually I'm going to start on my bruschetta, sorry. That's a proper way to say it. I used the American version, bruschetta, for a long time, but someone recently said, no, it's bruschetta. So basically, I'm almost there. Let me just put a tiny bit more. I'm just going to do it kind of fast. And we have to let this rise for about 45 minutes to an hour in a warm place. So that's starting to look really nice and smooth. Next thing, I'm going to give this one a little bit of a rest, and I'm going to go ahead and start with my bruschetta. Let me just wash my hands. Okay. And I'll just let this rest in this clean towel while I start the bruschetta. First of all, you want to take off the top part of the tomato. And I advocate for people to cut things that are flat as opposed to cutting something that's round. I think that that's very difficult. So try to make a flat surface that you can cut with. And this does not have to be meticulously small, nor does it have to be huge chunks. Just about 1/4 of an inch by 1/4 of an inch is fine. Ideally, one would use a serrated edge knife, but I find that these knives, these professional knives, are sharper than most of my serrated, so I'm using them. But a serrated edge knife, a knife with teeth, can really work very well with tomatoes. So once again, I cut off the top where the root end is, then I cut flat surfaces, and then I go ahead, I've got about 2 cuts here, and then about 2 cuts this way. And once again, you want to try to keep a claw hand as you're cutting so that your knuckles are actually the only thing that are exposed. Your fingers are actually protected by your knuckles. So if you were to cut yourself, it would only be skinning the knuckle. If you see a bad part in the tomato, go ahead and just cut it out. Usually it's just a small brown spot. Usually you don't have to sacrifice the whole tomato. Now, a lot of times it's very, very hard to get fresh basil. I know that oftentimes I can't find it in the market or the quantity that I need. So what I do is I go and I buy bulk basil, a big case of it, and I make a lot of pesto. And I omit the nuts and the cheese, only because if I want to freeze it, you can't freeze it if there are nuts and cheese in it, because both of those things make the texture, they change the texture and they don't freeze well. So what I did in this case, because once again I knew that I wouldn't have the basil by today, is I made a big batch of pesto. And really all this is fresh basil, olive oil, and garlic, and a little bit of salt. So normally what we do is we put shredded pieces of basil and garlic and olive oil, but I have most of it in here, so I just have to add a little bit of olive oil. Okay, so now that I've got this done, I'm going to go ahead and season my tomatoes, my bruschetta. I'm going to put some salt. And do season and then retaste and season again. Crushed red cracked black pepper. And then of course the basil, I'm going to go ahead and use about 2 tablespoons. Here's one, and here's another. And then a little bit of olive oil. Just about 1/8 of a cup. You don't need a ton. Just enough to kind of help things along a little bit. And this should really be garlicky and full of basil and pungent and sweet with the tomatoes. And also you want to have a bit of spice and a bit of salt. It's perfect. Good. And that's what my bruschetta looks like. And I love to take this same bruschetta and use it on fresh pasta, especially in the summertime. It's a wonderful fresh tomato sauce. So while we're doing that, I'm going to go ahead and roll out my focaccia. So let me just clean off my surface. Okay, now I'm going to add just a little bit of flour. Spread that out. And let me go ahead and take my dough and place it down. And let me just get my rolling pin out. Hold on. So, rolling out the focaccia. You have your bench flour down. Start from the middle, and rather than going back and forth as you would assume, this stuff really wants to rise. It's ready to go. So we have to kind of work with it and make it resist that urge. So I'm going to keep moving it around, and I'm actually going to go in one direction and off to the edge, because what I'm really doing is I'm really pulling and pushing this dough. Okay, there's my flour. A little bit more. And I want it to be somewhat the size and shape of the sheet pan that we were using. So I'm going in one direction from the center, off the edge. One direction from the center, off the edge. Okay. I'm almost there. That looks pretty even. I'm trying to get the thickness even. It's quite thin right now, and it looks perfect all the way around the edge. Now, one of the easiest ways to get this onto a sheet pan is actually to roll it. So what I'm going to do, I'll roll it from here. Make sure if you do roll your dough, you have to make sure there's plenty of flour so that it doesn't stick to itself. And you also want to flour your rolling pin. So you grab it, and you go ahead and roll. And then I'm going to grab a sheet pan. And just bring the sheet pan to the dough as opposed to bringing the dough to the sheet pan. And then just delicately unroll. There you go. If you've got some extras on the side, you can just move it around, tuck it in a little bit. It can even be a little bit of a crust if you want. Doesn't have to be perfection. Okay, and then I'm going to let this rise for about 40 minutes. If this had risen, what we would do next is go ahead and put indentations. These indentations don't look like much right now because it's a very thin dough and it hasn't risen, but once it rises, it's like a pillow, and you put your little fingers in to make the indentations. And then you pour about 1/4 cup of olive oil on the surface, and they actually just go right into these wonderful little indentations, and they stay there. And that's focaccia. Now, one thing about focaccia that I have learned from my friends in Italy is that it is not pizza. So you can top it with bruschetta or other things, pesto, or sometimes they even top it. One of my friends does olive oil, garlic, and very thin potato slices. But they discourage you from putting cheese on the focaccia because they want to differentiate pizza from focaccia. So they don't mind tomato pulp and garlic. They don't mind a lot of different toppings, but they say resist the urge to use cheese because we already have pizza, and technically they have a lot of things with cheese, and the things that they don't want to have with cheese, they really want to keep it very separate and very clean tasting. So that's the situation. I'm not going to do the olive oil yet because it has to rise. So I'm just going to put this aside and let it rise, and I'm going to go check on my focaccia and see if it's done. Okay, welcome back. Now we're back. I just went to get this out of the oven, and this is what it looks like. It's beautiful. It's a little slightly golden brown, and we just want to get it off this pan so we can cut it up and serve it with the bruschetta. It's still really hot, so I'm going to use this towel to hold on to while I cut it up. And you should see a really nice little doughy bread situation. You could serve this at room temperature. This doesn't have to be served hot. Typically, bruschetta is served on grilled bread, but it's just as good at room temperature. So if you have a party, you can make this beforehand. I'm just going to cut this into pieces that people can handle. Okay. And because the bruschetta is at room temperature, I really wouldn't serve this right out of the oven. I think it's really nice to enjoy the fact that this is cold, and I think that it would warm it up. So I would suggest actually letting this cool a little bit. And the way this is served is typically you just take a slice of bruschetta and then go ahead. I use a slotted spoon so it drains the oil out, so it's not a big greasy mess, but then you just top it with this and you can serve it. It is a little messy, but it's really, really, really good, and you can also dip your bread in directly. So welcome to Hey Jude, What's Cooking? I hope you enjoyed this very easy, very fast little appetizer, and hopefully you'll try it at home. Bon appetit. You want to have that really strong, powerful basil. Yes, in olive oil with garlic or with anything, just not with, you just,